listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to www.nakedbibleblog.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 34, Naked Bible Podcast, version 2.0. I'm your residential layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike.
Hi, Trey.
How are you?
Oh, good. Glad we could do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say thank you for letting me to be a part of this, and I feel very honored and blessed to be here, and I hope I can add value to the show.
You know, I feel relieved that you're here. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I certainly appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you stepping forward to volunteer to help out.
You bet.
So I think it's fair for you to chime in a little bit here at the beginning, Trey, and tell listeners a little bit about yourself and why you decided to get involved, sort of what prompted that, and so people can get to know you a little bit.
Well, I have a BBA, Bachelor's of Business Administration, and MIS, Management Information Systems, which is a computer degree. So I've been doing podcasts for probably right around since it started, almost, I think coming up on 10 years or whatnot. But I thought I'd offer my services for the show. I really appreciate the work that you've been doing. I first discovered you in 2004, believe it or not. It's been almost a decade, but
wow.
I've been incorporating your work into my Bible study. I've been aware of the divine counsel for over 20 years, believe it or not, and it wasn't until I discovered you 10 years later than that it would help me articulate what it is I'm reading. I wasn't the only one that was reading this stuff, and it was such a relief that there is actually a scholar out there that was putting brain power towards this knowledge that nobody else seemed to talk about or knew anything about. And ever since then, I've been reading everything you publish, watching all your videos. I even attempted to take your Hebrew and Greek class when you first did that, I think 2009, 2010-ish.
Yeah, it's been a while ago.
Yeah, but that was right around my first newborn, so that kind of taking care of my newborn.
So much for that idea.
Hebrew. Yeah, it was. There went the Greek and Hebrew, but I nonetheless still have the material and I reference it, and it's it's hard work being a scholar. So hats off to you. Reminds me of one of my favorite quotations we have, and we use it here in the office all the time. Friedrich Donker of the Bauer, Donker, Arnton, Gingrich Greek lexicon, Greek-English lexicon, was famous for saying that the work of scholars is not for sissies. No, it is not. And I'm technical, so I'm very logical, and I study all the time because that's what I do in my day-to-day job is computer support. So I have to learn everything. I've done a bit of programming in my day, and that's just as intense. It's amazing how just the mere act of being logical can apply to even the Bible, which I don't think a lot of people approach the Bible logically. I think they approach it more emotionally. And sometimes that can be good or bad, but it's the logical aspect of it that really interests me, and I think the community that listens to the show.
Yeah, I would agree. A lot of people sort of get Bible tidbits or sort of snacks. They're disparate. They aren't connected. They're just sort of handed out, on a week-to-week basis, or even if they're reading their Bible, there's an element of randomness to it. So, once you start to wonder, how does this stuff all connect? Surely there's got to be something beyond, again, just this, read this bit here, read that bit here, and sort of be warmed and filled, that kind of thing. And so when you want to try to connect ideas, you need to be able to think in a linear way and clearly and coherently.
Yeah, and it's challenging for a lot of people. It's kind of how I tend to approach the world on everything that I do, but talking to my wife and talking to my friends, and when I bring up this topic or even anything logical like computers and whatnot, it's people just eyes start to glaze over, and you can just see them tuning out, and there goes that conversation.
Yeah, well, I don't think they're probably not tuning out the need for logic, because whether we think about it or not, things have to make sense to us. They're probably just tuning you out in the level of detail. That's what happens to me all the time anyway.
I can relate. So that's what's good about this show is I think the Naked Bible Podcast show gives the people who are actively seeking out that level of detail
I think they'll find it here. Is that the goal of this version 2.0, or even the original idea of this podcast?
Yeah, the original idea was, again, to be doing something as far as delivering content. I would get requests all the time for teaching content, and I didn't really know how to do it. A lot of the episodes in the original version were scripted, and that just took a lot of time. And the reason I scripted it was, I would take something I had written and put it into sort of a podcast, readable form where it wouldn't sound like I was just reading everything. But that was to sort of take care of post-production problems, or just really time that I would have had to put into it, once the material's recorded. But eventually that caught up to me. So, the podcast sort of went by the wayside because of the work that it entailed. And I hit a wall too with things like storage space. I was having to delete episodes off what I was doing because of the expense and whatnot. So, I tried to not go into it completely empty-headed, but there were just things that you missed or didn't anticipate, and other things sort of crowded it out. But it's really about dispensing content. And I think that's true, for the 2.0, the reboot, as well. If people who maybe have not followed the blog, the Naked Bible blog, would not know that the reboot really came about as in response to a question I put out there, which was basically, hey, should I be doing something more here in terms of content? And I was thinking at the time, like, of a weekly teaching sort of thing. So it was one of those phases where I was just getting a lot of interaction with people about, what they weren't learning in church, and, sort of dry spells, and it just sort of converged. And out of that discussion, whenever I hear that kind of thing, I'm really big on, it's the responsibility of scholars to do things for the non-specialist, for the quote unquote lay community. And so I always tend to feel guilty when I hear that. And once we got into it, and the response was just so overwhelming. I mean, I figured, people would be warm to this idea. I'd get 20 or 30 comments about this, but I got over 100. It was just crazy. And so I thought, if I'm going to do something like this, the podcast seems like a logical way to go. And then you had stepped forward to volunteer to help me do something. So what I want to do is really largely unscripted this time, but I want to just sort of work through the text. Start someplace. We're going to start with the book of Acts, and sort of let you read it through my eyes, sort of look over my shoulder, and I will stop at places and instances to discuss things that I think are interesting or important for understanding the passage, and that tie into things that listeners may be familiar with if they've followed my work at all, maybe not. But that's okay, because we have some orientation videos on the podcast website people can watch, and I would encourage them to do that, so that when I start talking about the divine counsel worldview, people won't just be lost, but they will have some framework. But I just want to work through the text. I want to read through the text with people and produce sort of a verbal commentary, and we'll park on certain things that are really fascinating. And we're not going to be turning over every rock or anything like that. We want to get through material. But that's the basic idea.
Yeah, sounds great. I know certainly this is going to, you have no idea what this is going to do for my Bible study, just being on the show. I'm going to have to go to the next 2 levels, but that's great. I'm looking forward to it. You mentioned about the website stuff. I want to take a pause here and talk some technical talk, if you don't mind, for the
Sure.
listeners out there. But if you'll notice, we have a new website, nakedbiblepodcast.com. Our feeds are live. I notice iTunes currently has the feed. We may be making some tweaks here and there, but for the most part, the feeds are working. I will be submitting those feeds to all of the podcast places normally, like the Windows Store on Microsoft, so you'll be able to get it there. I'm going to submit it to the point where any application you use on your phone, whether it be Android, iPhone, or whatnot, whatever podcasting software you use, I want this feed. I want you to be able to download our shows using whatever software you prefer. So bear with me. Those feeds will be live here within the week or so. Please email me at trey.strickland, and that's trey.striklin@gmail.com. If you have any technical questions or need help getting our shows, I'm more than happy to help do that. Our website, you'll be able to play our shows on the website. You can actually go to there and listen. You can download the shows from our website if you want. And there's two buttons on there. One button on the front page says subscribe via iTunes, and the other one is subscribe via RSS feeds. And I've had some confusion about subscribing via the RSS feeds. When you click it, it takes you to a page with a bunch of gibberish. It looks like code and whatnot. That's actually how it's supposed to work. So what you need to do is copy at the very top where it's www.podcast.com or whatever that you used to, you need to copy that URL feed. That's our feed. And you need to paste that into whatever podcast software you prefer. I know it's confusing, so if you have any questions, again, please email me. If you need to contact Mike about the show, his email is mshmichaelsheiser@gmail.com. And please, in the subject line of your email, include the Naked Bible Podcast and the episode number so we can refer to it and find it easier. We plan on accumulating some of the best questions, and maybe every fourth show or whatnot, we'll do a FAQ show and answer some of y'all's questions. And you can imagine that due to the amount of emails Mike gets, we're not going to be able to answer everybody's questions. So please understand that, and we certainly appreciate your questions. Mike, you have anything to...
Yeah, if people can't remember my email, or they're afraid they might misspell it, they could always go to my homepage. It's just drmsh.com, like doctor, and then my initials, drmsh.com, and then click on contact, and you can email me through that as well. But like Trey said, you need to put something in the subject line about the podcast so that I know that that's what it's pertaining to.
Absolutely. And, again, please follow Mike at MS Heiser on Twitter. I encourage everybody to go read his blogs at drmsh.com. I encourage all the listeners to go back and read as much of Mike's content as you can. There's a whole wealth of knowledge there that I thank you for doing that, because there's just, it's like an academic course in itself with all the knowledge that you post, and the amount of time that you put into this is amazing.
Well, I think generally that pastors and scholars really underestimate the interest level of, again, the quote-unquote layperson. And so I realize that I want to keep things like jargon to a minimum, and scholars have their own little language that they use when they speak to each other at conferences and whatnot. So trying to weed some of that out, but I think that people want content. I think people who are interested in Scripture really do want content. They don't mind having their thinking stretched, and they certainly don't need to be protected from their Bible. So that's just how I approach things. Again, if you're not familiar with me, you'll want to go to the blog, like Trey said, and do some of that. And we will, again, try to have more connectivity, more transparent connectivity between the podcast website and the blog website. There's already visually some of that with the design, and I should thank my webmaster, Joe Fioramonto, if I'm saying his last name correctly or not. I always have to be looking at it, but I'm not at the present. But Joe does a great job. All these graphics are things that he created. They're wonderful. So visually, there's already some of that, but we can build some more connectivity into it. And by all means, if you have suggestions, let me or Trey know about things you'd like to see happen on the podcast website. We'd like to hear it.
Absolutely. And we also have a place on there. If you're new to the show, it's new, start here. I encourage everybody to click that, and Mike's made 4 videos that you can watch to kind of get you up to speed on what the Divine Council worldview is, and kind of get you up to speed. So I encourage everybody to do that. And also on the About page on our website, you can find our email address and contact information. It's also there as well.
It might be helpful, too, for people to think of it this way. What I'd like to do in these episodes is if we were in church together and you're sitting next to me and I could give you sort of live play-by-play commentary through a passage, that's what I'm going to do. And again, it's not going to be overturning every stone. I'm not going to be using grammar speak.
We're not going to be doing things like that. I mean, when it matters to get into original languages, I'll do that. But again, I'll do it in a way that is decipherable. But that's sort of the analogy. As we're reading through the text or somebody's preaching through a text, I will invariably notice things that, I wish, he'd spend some time on this. I wish, this content would be, out there, because people would find this fascinating. But again, you have to have some context for it. So that's what the videos are for, and that's what the blog is for. And I'm not going to stop to do that with every episode of the podcast. So we're telling you up front to put a little time into getting caught up, but you'll get the hang of it. And again, that's sort of what we're going to be doing. Just, side by side, going through the text and, learning lots of things.
I'm excited. I know from the amount of feedback you got, there are a lot of people that are excited too.
Mm-hmm.
So I put together, since this is our inaugural version, 2.0 reboot show, I put together 10 questions that maybe we could go through and we both
Sure.
can answer, mainly geared towards you, but I thought it would just be entertaining to have a couple questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, well, the first question I have for you is, I know you get this one a lot, but which Bible translation do you prefer? And I know the difference between the dynamic equivalence and formal equivalence in regards to translating the Bible, where the dynamic is being more of what does the verse mean. It's easier to read in modern language, which you're in the hands of the interpreter, compared to the formal equivalence, which you prefer, and getting picky about the exact word. Could you briefly expand on that for the listeners that are new?
Sure. And if people want something, again, to reference, if you go to drmsh.com and click on Naked Bible, the tab there, or the image on the slider, and you get to the blog page, on the right-hand column, there's something called versions, because I do get this question a lot. I lean toward formal equivalence because I like translations that leave ambiguity in the text where ambiguity is in the text, for one thing. I don't like translations that are too interpretive, but on the other hand, they need to also not be rigidly literal and non-communicative. So I like something in between. I think ESV does a reasonable job of that. It's sort of in between. Might lean a little bit toward formal. I also prefer to use the ERSV really for one other reason, and that is it's more textually up to date. For instance, in Deuteronomy 32:8, a passage that I will reference a number of times, the ESV reads "sons of God" and not "sons of Israel." So it has adopted a demonstrably valid original superior reading from the Dead Sea Scrolls into its running text at that point, as opposed to just putting it in a footnote like a lot of other modern translations do. So the ESV, I think, has more of an eye to that. It doesn't do it as often as it could, or maybe that I'd like, but it does do it, and so that's kind of nice. So, the sort of the non-academic answer to the question of the best Bible version is the one you'll read. But
sure, but for the sake of our listeners,
just for the sake of the listeners, that's how I think about it. My preference is the ESV just for that, those two reasons: the more textually up to date, and I think it largely tries to strike a balance between formal equivalence, the quote unquote literalism, and yet still being free enough that it's readable.
Okay, so my second question is a follow-up. What's the chance for a Naked Bible, Dr. Heiser translated Bible?
Slim and none. The odd thing is we actually have. I work for Logos Bible Software. We produced our own translation, and it sort of came about in an odd sort of way, and I think in some respects it might be a little premature. But we were creating our own sort of translation to use internally in the building to build other products in the software world. And I did Genesis for that. So I have had the experience of doing a translation at one book level. And that was pretty much enough to cure my to cure any interest in having to do that. So I would say that's not something I'm going to devote much time to.
Okay, fair enough. All right, third question, Star Trek or Star Wars?
Oh, I'd have to go with Star Wars.
Okay, I was going
But
to.
I really like the two Star Trek, the more recent ones, the remake.
You can't go wrong with either one, but I'm going to go Star Wars as well. All right, the fourth question I have for you is, do you recall the moment you became aware of the divine counsel? Was it a big moment for you, or did it slowly progress through your studies?
Yeah, I do. I actually used the anecdote in the first chapter of the Unseen Realm, which is a book that's going to come out in another couple months. We're hoping by the end of March in 2015.
Which I've
Sort
waited
of,
6 years for.
yeah, well, I can't wait to see it born too. But I actually used that in there. It was during church. A friend and I were sort of killing some time before the service, and I don't remember what we were talking about, but I'll never forget how the conversation ended. He handed me his Hebrew Bible, and it was open to Psalm 82, and he said, "Read the first verse." And I read that, and it was like, holy cow, how have I not seen that before? And so that was sort of a watershed moment, and it was I don't remember a word of the sermon, couldn't tell you really anything about what happened the rest of the day, but I was hooked.
Yeah.
And I had to know more about this and all the questions that it generated.
Yeah, same for me. When you first pick up on the supernatural part of the Bible, it just gets fascinating, and I think there's a lot of people, including our listeners, that gravitate towards that aspect of the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it there's an element of mystery, and mystery is always appealing. But at the same time, it's not just sort of a simple standard point of curiosity, because there are core elements of Christianity, and when that little vision, as telescope that it is on the Trinity and Jesus and angels and demons, which are very neutral, sort of bland terms, and then that scope starts to widen, then it's more than just a general curiosity. It's like, well, what in the world's really going on? Going on over there? And how does that world intersect with the human world? And does the Bible really say much about that? Because frankly, what we're used to hearing the terms angels and demons, somebody will read through the Gospels and it'll be a scene of possession or something like that. But that's really about all that you get. You get this sense that there are black hats and white hats, and it pretty much dies there. And there's just so much more to it. So I think people want to know it. They're curious, but then when they get into it, they can start to see not only what is happening, but all the ramifications, the way it affects lots of other things.
So my next question is, what about the supernatural aspect of the Bible that makes Christians so uncomfortable?
Well, I think Psalm 82, if we could just start there. I mean, this whole idea that God is over a council, is in control of a council of Elohim, divine beings. And it sounds like a pantheon. And that word has become a negative word for us because of Greek mythology and other things. But in and of itself, yeah, a pantheon is a council. So the idea is there. But what the Bible says about that is quite a bit different than what you're going to read somewhere else. So just the fact that this collective exists, and you might think, well, why would people be freaked out about that? We have things like the heavenly host and phrases like that. Well, the answer is they don't really think of it as a group that does anything, because we've sort of been trained that God has like decided everything ahead of time, and nobody can really do anything without God ordaining it, and there's no sense to having this group that really works for God or does anything for God or can do anything meaningful because everything's settled. Once you start really unraveling that and frankly undermining it with the Bible, once you start getting into that sort of thing, it's troubling to people, because then the beings outside the Trinity actually do things that matter, and they're actually not all on leashes. All their actions are not predetermined. We have, again, there's plenty of passages that get into this. People can read The Unseen Realm when it's out, to get into all of them. But that alone, really sort of bothers people. And it really doesn't need to. The analogy is us. Okay, God doesn't need us either. But yet he uses people to do things like evangelize, okay? To teach people about Scripture, to do X, Y, Z, fill in the blank. God uses agents, human agents, to do all sorts of things. And so why is it so astonishing that he would use non-human, divine agents to work for him as well, and actually give them participatory ability, capability, and permissions and whatnot? So we're just not used to thinking that. It's us and God, it's us and the Trinity, and then, there's these white hats and black hats floating around out there somewhere, but that's where the story typically ends. And there's not a lot said about how it all works and what it means, and what's predestined and what isn't, and all this sort of stuff that sort of accrues to the idea of being free will agents, being intelligent agents that God made and function as God made them to function. We sort of all just shut that off and never really think about it.
Absolutely. When the Pope listens to this podcast and reads your books that are coming out, Unseen Realm, do you expect any blowback from the church? And what are some of the resistance or pushback you get from the church community from your work?
Yeah, I don't really expect anything from the Pope, nor do I expect him to be listening anytime soon.
He might.
Well, I guess in theory he could, sure. Like I like to tell George Norrie, well, I could be the next American Idol too, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, just in case the Pope's listening, I'm just going to give him a shout out. Hey, Pope.
I think that the pushback I get comes more generally in that you always get the question, well, why haven't we heard this before? And the honest answer is that because there's a number of honest answers. There's tradition. Really, what is filtered down to people in church is really a distillation of biblical content that is very minimal. It's important, but it's minimal. And it's filtered, again, through history, through certain traditional trajectories, depending on what denomination a person is from or not. And so you get the sort of a crib note version of the Bible and biblical theology. And so when you have somebody like me come along and say, hey, it's about time you read the other 90% and forget about your tradition, because the stuff you're going to encounter in the Bible isn't really covered in lots of creeds and doctrinal statements and catechisms and things like this. And you're just going to have to decide at some point that my theology really needs to come from the text and not this filtering system. When people hear me say things like that, they assume that I'm antagonistic to those things, and I'm not. What I actually am is I'm basically apathetic toward them. I don't view them in a hostile way, but while I think they can help occasionally, and I understand that a pastor has a tough job, a pastor would be a tremendous success if everybody who sat under his preaching really had a grasp of the basics of a particular creed or tradition. That would be great, because a lot of Christians don't. They don't even know that. But beyond that, there's this whole thing we call the Bible that is living and is inspired and exists outside of the creedal formulations. And God wasn't just wasting his time or the people he prompted to write when they produced this thing we call the Bible. It has import. Everything in there is there for a reason. It has a role to play in the larger world of biblical thinking and biblical theology, and therefore, a la 2 Timothy 3:16, the way we should think and live as well. But you never get to it. And so some people are bothered by, well, you're insulting my tradition. You're saying I don't learn a lot of Scripture.
Well, you got one of those two things right. I am saying you don't know a whole lot about Scripture and you haven't learned a lot, but I don't mean to insult anyone's tradition. There's a logistic problem here. Again, pastors are just about keeping people in the faith, teaching them the basics, encouraging them to live the way they should, being a sympathetic ear to their problems and trying to be a practical help to them. I mean, that's what pastors are. It's an important job. It's a job I could not do. But there's so much beyond that in terms of this thing we call the Bible. And so they're so absorbed in those other duties, they often don't have the time to teach people. And frankly, I'm not going to put the blame on the pastor. A lot of the blame can be laid at the foot of the person in the pew just doesn't have an interest. And you could say, well, that's because it's not interesting from the pulpit. Okay, I get that. I understand that, but going back to our Friedrich Donker quote, the work of scholars is not for sissies. Well, learning anything reasonably well is also not for sissies. You have to put some work into it. And so I'm hoping to be, again, part of that solution, to be part of the solution, not part of the problem when it comes to this. But it troubles some people because they take it personally. But they don't need to. That isn't what it's about.
Okay. Next question. Are you a Nephilim?
No, I'm not.
Because I'm like 164th Navajo. So are you like 116th Nephilim? I mean,
No, I would die. I'm over 6 feet tall, but I don't think that counts for much.
Okay. Because I'm over 6 feet as well, and so
Yeah.
so people accuse me of being Nephilim, but I just say no. It's Navajo, not Nephilim.
I have been accused of being a government disinformant, but I've never been accused of being a Nephilim. So
Well, it's always
There
a
we go.
first.
yeah, there you go.
So you mentioned the Logos software that you work for, and it's a great tool for Bible study. Do you recommend a version of that for us, common people, for our individual Bible study, or any other software or tips and tricks and tools that could aid in our efforts?
Well, the software itself, I mean, there are about 8 or 9 different what we call base packages or collections. And I think they range from a couple $100 all the way up to over $1,000. So, if you want to spend money, sure. But we've actually created a number of free things that I think if you're not doing anything in Bible study beyond just reading the Bible, in other words, and by the way, I should say Bible study is not Bible reading. Okay, those are two different things. People think because they read it, they're studying it. Well, they're not. You're not if you think that. But if you want to graduate from reading, what most people do is they get a study Bible. That's a good idea. We actually have our own. It's called the Faith Life Study Bible. And you can put that into Google, Faith Life Study Bible, go to the link and download it for free. And it's bigger. It's got about 3 million words in it. It's bigger than most study Bibles, and it's expanding all the time because it lives in the digital world. And it comes with something called the Lexham Bible Dictionary, which we created in-house. I wrote the notes to the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Old Testament, Joshua, Judges, and then I cherry-picked chapters I cared about. So a lot of the notes in the Faith Life Study Bible are mine. That's not exclusively why I recommend it, but it's a free resource. It's a lot of material. It takes you into a lot of good stuff, and you can have it right on your phone or on your computer, whatever. And we often have people graduate from that. They get interested in biblical material, and then they start thinking about getting into original languages. And for that, you do need the software. And we've created something called reverse interlinears, which allow you to run searches on English words. But what you don't know is that the search you're running is actually on the Greek or the Hebrew or the Aramaic from which the translation derives. You don't see any of that visually. But you can actually get into primary texts, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, through your English translation and get the results back of your searches in English. And there are dozens of reports that help you understand that material, direct you to other material. But I say, for people who aren't, really that into it, start with the free stuff, and then you can graduate from there and get into some of the more significant tools.
Great. Next question. I'm curious, what does the Christian community think of your UFO interest?
Well, it depends. If people are patient enough, beyond sort of the question and the snicker that follows, then they get to understand why I do what I do. If I want to tweak somebody, I basically tell them that I could have a more substantial spiritual discussion with someone at a UFO conference than you could have at church, and that's something they typically don't like. But it in large sense is true, because when you get into what we would loosely call the paranormal, the occult, the esoteric, that sort of thing, people who are into that, whether they have jettisoned Christianity to get there or they never entertained Christianity at all, the people who are into that stuff are thinking big picture things. They're thinking about, is there a God? If there's a God, what's that God like? What is my relationship to that God? Did he make me or not? Why am I here? Is there purpose in life? Is there direction in history? Is there any oversight of any superior beings to what we're doing here? These are all inherently theological questions. And so you go to some of these events, or you engage people on a radio show or online who are into this stuff. They are primed and ready to talk about that kind of stuff. Whereas a lot of people at church, they'll talk to you and they'll use the right words, but they have not thought deeply about much of it at all. It's an inherited tradition that they embrace. They like it. It's meaningful to them, but they haven't really sort of knocked it around a lot. And that's why you can have more substantive discussions in many cases. Going to one of these events, even though the conversation might feel hostile in places, it's going to have a depth that you often don't get. And I think it's a good thing, because frankly, the Great Commission, as I read it, doesn't exclude people who believe strange things. They're not the group that we're not supposed to present the truth to. There's nothing like that. And so even, again, if someone who asks me that sort of, snickers about it, and I've had that happen plenty of times, it's like, well, so what I'm reading from you is that you're telling me I really shouldn't care about the people in this group. And you're sort of assigning them to insignificance. Is that what I'm hearing? And again, that's not another comfortable question for that person, but they get the hint pretty quickly. And I'm fairly direct about it, not in a defensive way, but I want them to realize that if you were doing this, you'd get into lots of interesting conversations, and you'd have lots of good opportunities to talk about what you do believe. And then, do some apologetics, do some evangelism, do some things like that.
Yeah, I find it very interesting. I've got some friends that are pastors and preachers, and I like to keep them on their toes. And at the very beginning of these deep conversations, I would ask them, what's your explanation for aliens? And just to watch them struggle to articulate a coherent thought when it comes to the Bible. It's astonishing how...
Yeah, if this turns out to be the case, then you're going to have to be able to do more than just him and haw, about it. You're going to have to, articulate something that's coherent, that's theologically coherent. But, chances are they've never thought about it.
Okay, last question. If you could do any other job or be something different than your profession now, what would you do or be?
I would be the commissioner of Major League Baseball.
Oh, wow.
I was actually thinking about this today, just because I really like my job. Like, are there other jobs that I would rather have than this job? It's just sort of riding in on the bus today. And I thought, I can only think of two things I'd rather do. One would be to just, write whatever I want at any other time, sort of be the self-employed, I guess you'd call it. And the other would be the commissioner of Major League Baseball.
Now, does that come from, did you play baseball growing up?
Oh, I did. I played a little bit in high school. I played some in college. But I love the game, and I know all the criticisms. Oh, it's too slow. Nothing happens. Well, if you want nothing happens, then you watch soccer. Okay. It's just, soccer is sort of points of brilliance and thrill that are sort of
encompassed about by mind-numbing boredom 95% of the time. But baseball, if you actually understand the game, there's just a lot going on even when there doesn't seem to be. All the signaling, all the positioning, people looking at, the one fielder looks at the other one and he moves 2 steps to the left. I mean, there's a lot going on there. So it's kind of a cerebral game in that respect. You don't have to pack as much away in your head as you would with football, obviously, but there's just a lot going on, and it's one of those things that gets played everywhere. It is the American pastime, and it has a history to it. It's just unique in a lot of respects. A lot of football fans, for instance, can't reference someone who played in the 1920s and what they did. But you ask a serious baseball fan, they know, the important figures of the game really at all stages. And they can do that. And everybody who plays today is measured against those other people. And it has this continuity to it that I think I find really sort of intriguing and just kind of neat. There's just a lot that goes into it. So I would love to be the commissioner of Major League Baseball.
That's interesting. My first home run as a kid was a grand slam. So
oh, wow.
I've actually hit a grand slam. That was when I hit the ball
in front of people
in an organized game in front of people. I remember the feel of the ball on my bat. I hit it right in the sweet spot on the bat, and it just took off. And I just knew once I made contact, it was gone. And it's just such a feeling that's hard to explain, but it was awesome.
Yeah, and it has this childhood thing too. It takes you back to your childhood because you played. And so that's part of it too.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, that's all the questions I have for you. You have anything else you want to add to the show?
No. I think we're good to go, and we should in a reasonable amount of time, figure all the little quirks out, that things that aren't quite up to snuff on the website, but all that'll work itself out, and we'll be ready to go.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.